So here we have a sculpt sent in by Gerickos Art. Gerico, I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing it. He or she says, hey, here is a sculpt of an orc I did. I'd love to have critiques from you. I'd like to 3D print it. The 3D print version won't have the arrows. Thanks for your videos, no problem. Let's go ahead and check it out. So this is the original model that was sent in to me. And it's 12 million polygons, and it has frozen subdivision levels. So I'm not sure if you're aware that it had frozen subdivision levels. That might be intentional, but I would not recommend continuing to sculpt on something like this, especially if it's for 3D print. So my first note here is a little bit more technical than focusing on aesthetic. So I would encourage you to do what I've done here. And especially since this is 3D print, you want to be thinking about the scale that you're going to be printing this at, the printing technology that you're going to be using, and the type of material that you're going to be printing this in. So for instance, if you're just FDM printing this with like PLA, there's a lot of texture and form here that's really just not going to come through in the print if this is going to be, you know, fitting a standard household printer, which I'm assuming that it will. I'm assuming that this is going to be, you know, for sure under like 10 inches or so. I might be wrong. So what I've done is I have taken your character, and you really can't tell too much of a difference between these two, but I have remeshed this down to a fourth of your original poly count, and I have done this with subdivision levels. So if I take this model and I just rotate around this and try to like move with this in the 3D space, it's pretty laggy. But working with this, as I start to rotate around, it drops the model down to my lowest subdivision level, if you're aware of this, or for those that aren't aware of this. So it makes it a little bit easier to work on this kind of stuff. And I have a pretty beastly computer in terms of RAM. I have 64 gigs of RAM. I work with very large files very often of, you know, hundreds of millions of polygons, so I need that. So even on something like this, for one mesh that's like 12 million polys, you're kind of getting up there towards the upward limits of what you would want for sculpting on something like this. But yeah, let's talk about the actual aesthetic and form. I think I'll turn off your arrows and some of the other stuff down here, since it's not a part of what is being printed, as you mentioned. So I don't think we need to really comment on the rocks and the base stand. The only thing I will say about your stand is that you might want to... So right now this is what? This is like 8 units tall. So if you were printing this in inches, I don't know if you are. This could be anything. Most likely it's completely arbitrary, which is typically how it is. But you might want to just check the thickness on this guy. Make sure that he's going to be at a good size for printing that stand. You don't want that to get super thin, so you might want to thicken that up. Because it's so wide, stability probably will not be an issue, especially since it's fitting within the bounding box of that pretty well. So let's actually talk about, again, enough technical stuff, right? Let's get into the aesthetic. So I think you've done a good job on certain areas of textures, and I think you've done less so on other areas. So let's kind of compare and contrast, and I can point out what I'm talking about here. So we have some of these scarring textures going on over here, and I really like the way that you handled some of these. For example, I think this area is a lot stronger than, for example, this kind of area up here. And let me explain why. So the way that you've handled this positive scar, and this might just be, well, no, that's not true. Never mind. Scratch that. So I'm not sure if it's just because of the way that you tackled this or what, but you've started to build up the primary shape, obviously just the anatomy of the body. Then you started to build up the secondary form of the scar, starting to get some of this secondary just kind of hits in here, this kind of stuff, right? And then you started to use some, you know, alphas and quick textures and some other stuff on top of that. Over here, this feels kind of very just like brush strokey, alpha-y, very quick. And to me, this feels very, very much like a texture that I would see on a rock, and less so like a fleshy kind of scar, like kind of what this is feeling like. So what I would recommend is maybe try to get some more of this kind of information in there. So maybe hit this again with something like a very low Z intensity standard brush, or a similar thing with the inflate brush, and start to get the surrounding area of that built up a little bit more, feeling a little bit fleshy. And you might be able to get some of these kind of horizontal kind of stretch marks around that scar going on as it started to heal up and maybe close up a little bit unevenly, because that's a pretty big scar, right? You would expect some kind of maybe some of this information going on there as well. So that's my note on kind of just the general information that I would like to see. Where this starts to get a little messy, let's say, is in the alpha situation on top. So you've used a lot of, and I can just kind of see this alpha everywhere, and I think I know what alpha this is if I just use the drag rectangle and grab I think it might be this alpha 58. It looks like the alpha 58. So that's what that looks like to me, or at least it's very similar, and you've kind of used it in a little heavy-handedly, kind of like blanket applied to a lot of different areas. So what my recommendation would be, and I don't think it's just that alpha, because if I rotate around to the back side, you have some of these kind of additional scars going on, but where you start to get into here, I can see a lot of kind of the similar alpha-y stroke going on back here. So I'm not sure, it looks like you've maybe used a combination of alphas, but what I would recommend doing is after you get to a place where you insert an alpha, also mention that this kind of detail will most likely not show up in your print, unless you're doing a larger SLA print. Probably a lot of that stuff is not going to come through in terms of texture. So I don't really think that's a huge concern of you for printing. But for sculpturally, I think what's really nice is that after you use an alpha, always come back through and give it that kind of human touch. So maybe you could use that light standard brush, the light inflate brush like I mentioned again. These almost feel a little veiny to me, like I don't think they are supposed to be veins because they're a little haphazard. So in all honesty, I would probably get rid of a lot of that kind of haphazard random texture. From a distance, it feels very brush strokey to me. And which is unfortunate, because a lot of the primary forms that you have done on here, transitioning into secondary shapes, have been done very well. So just kind of think about that. I often say that no amount of icing will help a bad cake, meaning that no amount of detail will help the bad underlying form. I think you have a little bit of that, but I think more so you have kind of some bad icing thrown on top of you've grabbed the sprinkles, but these sprinkles are like 100 years old and you just kind of threw them everywhere. That's maybe a bad analogy, but try to kind of beef up some of that information where it's getting repetitive and give it a little bit of that human touch. You also have a little bit of that going on down here where it feels a little brush strokey to me and less kind of skin textury. Feels a little clay tubesy. Like me just kind of stroking my clay tubes, it looks like almost the exact same texture. What else? What else do I want to say about this guy? I think he's cool. I think he's fun. I don't really have, too much to say other than kind of some of the stuff on the texturing. I don't know what you're using as a reference, so I can't really critique accuracy or anything like that. Maybe there's you might have been using some big muscle boys as your reference, as I like to call them. Maybe there's some weird, exaggerated asymmetry kind of coming down underneath some of this information with the pec where you're getting this really hard shadow there. I don't know what his arms are doing, so I can't really give more information on if this pec would be stretching more. This indicates to me that this arm would be raised up a bit more, but this arm feels like it's a lot higher than the other one, or at least like it's raised up a bit more if we look at where the bottom and top of that are hitting. So maybe that's something that you could pay attention to. It actually looks like this arm is, okay, I see. I was gonna say a lot shorter, like squashed. It's just that this one is twisted here. So, trying to think if that's how your pec would react. I don't know, maybe just take a second look at that stuff. Up here in your face, this is kind of where I think you've done a little bit of a better job texturing, especially through this area as you start to build up the initial shape of that scar, and then started to get in there with some of these more like hand-done secondary shapes. And then again, you know, getting through there with some alphas. So I think you've done a good job on a lot of this stuff. I don't think there's really anything else I'll say about this other than maybe something that you could look at if you're trying to get a little bit of a rougher kind of noisy texture in some of these areas. Instead of using some dragged out alphas, what you could do is use a standard brush, set it to spray, and then set your alpha to, whoops, one of these here. Let's do the, oh no wait, alpha 07, that's what I'm looking for. Trying to get like a kind of skin or pory type texture in here. This might be a little strong. It is. Let's turn this way down. And then just using some negative, you can start to get some noise in there in certain areas. And you might be able to use a really large brush in certain areas or a really small brush in others. Especially if you're using alphas, make sure you're, you know, using a lot of different sizes for that kind of stuff. But that might be a better idea, using some spray with one of those custom alphas that you're playing around with to try to get a little bit more variation instead of just using that drag rectangle is what it's called. So I think that's about it. That's about all I'll say on this dude. Good luck on printing him. I highly encourage you to decimate your original model if you're not going to be sculpting on this anymore. If you're unfamiliar with how to do that, just go up into your Z plugin menu, go under Decimation Master, pre-process your model, choose your percentage of decimation, and then decimate your model. This will be obviously after you have combined all the parts that you want to print at once. So I'm guessing that you're going to merge the body and everything into the stand and do this all as one single print. But good luck to you. Definitely post some images or share some stuff. I would love to see the finished print. But good luck, man. Very quickly, you know what? There is actually one other thing I will say, but I mentioned it on the last character, so I'll just mention it very briefly. I would also look at the integration of some of these parts, like your teeth and the rings here on the back, to make sure. I think you've done a little bit of a better job. Ooh, you know what? This one's really good. So the integration of that into the flesh feels a lot better than some of the other ones there, and the teeth. They feel a little bit stuck on there. So maybe work on the lips, feeling like they're really wrapping around that, feeling really fleshy, because it feels like the lips kind of just end here at the corners of the teeth. But yes, let's go ahead and move on to the next one. I think that's enough.